Conference on Innovation, Sustainability in Pension Fund Management. Our second panel is entitled Social, Environmental and Governance Factors and Investment on Pension Funds. We'd like to invite the chairperson of this segment, Mr. Sergio Aratangy, head of the Financial Division of the Pension Superintendents, and Michael Clark, Palencia, Waldo, Tapia, and Carola Moreno. At the end of this session, just like in the previous session, we'll have an extended segment for Q&A. The same format. There will be a Q&A segment for which you need to raise your hand, and somebody from the organization will have a microphone for you. Please introduce yourselves before asking your question. Nobody did during the previous session, so very briefly, please state your name and the institution you represent. I'd like to offer the floor now. We'll wait for Waldo Tapia then. And Sergio. Sergio. There's a microphone for the speakers who would like to talk, and panelists. There is... Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of chairing this panel. I believe it's a very interesting topic. I'd like to thank everyone involved in the organization, and I think this will bring about interesting discussions on a topic that is developing very quickly. I will wait for Mike to put on his headset for him to understand what I'm saying. So we have panelists of the highest quality and with different characteristics, which makes this discussion very rich. All of them with a very strong commitment to the development of green finance. So let me introduce them all, each one of them. First, Michael Clark, also known as Mike. He is a founding director of Ario Advisory, a responsible investment advisory firm. As an actuary, his work focuses on climate change, working with asset owners, financial regulators, and policymakers, etc. He was a special advisor to the UK Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee for its inquiry into green finance. He was an NED, non-executive director at Brunel, local government pension scheme, for almost 4 years, and he's a visiting fellow at the Global Systems Institute of the University of Exeter. He is a member of the team that presented real-world narrative scenarios incorporating climate risk to the university's retirement plan, which is a leading UK pension fund, to frame its investment strategy. Lizeth Palencia, she is the director for Spanish-speaking Latin America at Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, where she is in charge of promoting sustainable investment practices throughout the entire region. Prior to joining PRI, she managed the portfolio of state-owned companies in the energy and financial sectors of the Colombian Ministry of Finance. Lizeth has also contributed to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, where she developed sustainability policies and practices for corporate governance in Latin America, and has served as a board member of different companies in several companies in Colombia. Lizeth holds a master's degree in public policy from the Oxford University School of Government and a bachelor's degree in financial engineering from Universidad Autónoma de Bucaramanga in Colombia. Waldo Tapia is a lead specialist in the labor markets division of the Inter-American Development Bank, IADB, and since 2008 he has been responsible for the development of several projects in the area of labor markets and pensions in different countries in the region, and has taken part in a number of international fora. Prior to joining the IADB, he worked in the private pensions unit at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. He holds a master's degree in public policy from the Korea Development Institute School in Seoul, Korea, and a master's degree in economic theory and econometrics from the School of Economics in Toulouse, France. He is currently a regional specialist based in Colombia, regional coordinator of the pension area, and lead coordinator of the Pension Network of Latin America and the Caribbean, PLAC Network. And last speaker will be Carola Moreno. She is the coordinator of financial and international affairs at the Ministry of Finance of Chile. She holds a PhD in economics from Boston University, and she's a business engineer from Universidad de Chile. Previously, she was the head of the International Relations Unit of the Central Bank and was a deputy member of the Committee for the Setting of Exchange Rate Limits. Between 2021 and 22, she served as advisor for the manager of the Financial Policy Division in the issuing institution. In the period between 2017 and 2020, she worked as Chile's representative to the International Monetary Fund and as an advisor to the director of Southern Cone Office, OEDAG. OEDAG, is that the right name? Okay, thank you. She's very generous. Which is the IMF Executive Board. She was a senior economist and head of the External Monitoring Group of the Central Bank between 2012 and 2017. During the period of 2011-2012, she was a professor and director of the Center for Economics and Business Studies, CEN, at Universidad del Desarrollo. Previously, she was chief economist of the Global Trends Unit, UTG, and the Chile Studies Management of BBVA Bank. Between 1998 and 2001, she was an advisory economist to the coordination of international finance and capital markets of the Ministry of Finance. So there's no doubt about the quality of our speakers. It is important for the fact that Mike is going to speak in English, of course, and there's going to be interpretation equipment available. And for those who are in our streaming channel, you may choose the language of choice. First, each speaker will speak for a few minutes to trigger some discussion, and then there's going to be an open discussion, a Q&A period. Questions for each one of the panelists. Please, after the presentations, whenever you need to ask a question, please introduce yourselves. So without further ado, please, Mike, you have the floor.
So that's hopefully of interest. I'm going to walk around. I've entitled these remarks "Investing in the Real World" because we're actually not very good at doing that. We tend to invest with a sort of financial frame. And as I hope to demonstrate during the course of the next 20 minutes, I've just set my timer, so if you hear a beep, I'll stop. And I've called it, do we like numbers and models too much? and the implicit answer to that question from me is yes. At great personal expense, I got this done for me about a couple of years ago. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Earth Doctor looking a little bit worried. And on the right-hand side, well, you can do your own conclusions. We're not really listening to the science. Whether they're politicians, investors, insurance people, I'll leave up to you. But at the heart of this problem, we're not very good at uncertainty. Any of you who are in the room before lunch, I asked a question about risk and uncertainty, and we actually struggle with uncertainty, and part of the problem is we're human beings, we just don't like uncertainty. The way we have started to tackle that with one or two pension funds in the UK is to use scenarios. You will be familiar with scenarios as a corporate planning tool. Scenarios are plausible futures. We just don't know the path that the Earth and humanity is going to take. There's lots of uncertainty, so the way we are tackling with pension funds, some small number of pension funds in the UK so far, is to use scenarios as a planning tool. And they need to be real-world scenarios, not the scenarios framed by modern portfolio theory. We'll get to that a little bit later. And on the way, I just make the comment about transition plans. There's a developing argument for transition plans for everybody, actually, for governments, for financial regulators. A transition plan is coming to a place near you. A bit of recent history. Many of you will be familiar with TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They recommended scenarios, no surprise there. The central banks of the world set up the network for reading the financial system, NGFS. I guess in Spanish the initials might be in a different order, you're never quite sure. And they did scenarios. But what happens, this is why I upset the economists in the room, what happens when you give the modelling to economists? Well, very sensibly, they model what they can. And the modelers know there's lots of uncertainty, but that message gets lost as it leaves NGFS, goes to central banks, and gets used, certainly in the UK, by the investment consultants who advise pension funds. So there's a big but there. Now, this is published by a UK pension fund, and let's take the 8th line. So 4 degrees, 15 years. If we get to 4 degrees in 15 years, the pension fund thinks they're going to lose 70 basis points, 0.7%. Did I learn punto base this morning? Basis points. And there's other things. If you look at 1.6 and 1.5 degrees, in 5 years, it actually looks better. We're only going to lose 20 bips, not 1.7%, which seems the wrong way around. So there's some nonsense in the system, and that is partly, I sadly say, driven by regulation. Here's a question for you. As a fiduciary, do you think as a pension fiduciary your goal is portfolio decarbonisation, real-world decarbonisation, or risk management for resilience? When a friend of mine asked that at a pensions conference in the UK, everybody answered 1 or 2. Nobody answered number 3. I suggest number 3 is the correct answer. That's maybe for the Q&A. I'm now going to just run through a few things that have been published in the last 12 months. I'm an actuary. I'm pleased to say I'm the second actuary on the stage today. And my profession, together with the University of Exeter, published this document last year, The Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, which is just pointing out the points on the right. Many of the models, it's far too benign, far too relaxed. We may have seriously underestimated. Yes, it's not always a happy message, but we've got some good things near the end. And the carbon budgets could be much smaller than we think. So that was a professional actuarial document together with the climate scientists at Exeter, who are some of the best climate scientists in the world, boasted the visiting fellow. We then had a rather sharper piece. Some of you may have come across Carbon Tracker. That is a NGO. And at the heart of this, the first point is 2 degrees, 4.3 degrees, only minimal impact. If you stood back, even if you're not a climate scientist, you might think at 4 degrees things will be a bit different. Pension fund returns? No. So there's a huge disconnect between what the climate scientists are telling us and what finance is doing. And I've been spending a lot more time on this recently. Economists amongst you will have heard of a Minsky moment. A Minsky moment is when things sort of go pear-shaped. An economist told me not to use the term because a Minsky moment assumes recovery. But it's not guaranteed recovery. A bit more about scenarios. We actually know what the climate's going to do for the next 5 to 10 years. It's things like the weather and what people do that's important. The climate science for the next 5 to 10 years is pretty clear. There's some tipping points we're approaching. We may just get to that in the discussion. So the question is, going back to my earlier comments about NGFS, and we'll come to their recent publications in a moment, how easy is it to model the real world? Mass migration, market prices, Trump re-elected, yes or no, stranded labour, election outcomes, energy policy, citizen behaviour. It's very hard to model that. So just be careful of modelling. You don't need to read the detail. This was how we framed the scenarios that we did for USS, the university's pension scheme. Basically, when you do scenarios, you look for the most uncertain risk drivers. So we took market dynamism and policies, low, high, 4 scenarios. The top right-hand corner probably gets us to the Paris Agreement. Meltdown. One of the joys of scenarios is you just try and choose interesting names. Meltdown is what it says. But that was trying to frame the investment decision for pension fiduciaries in a real-world sense, not in the sense of modern portfolio theory. This is the paper. These are all available. I'm sure the slides will be made available after the conference, but these are all good items for your research department. But that is the document. Mirko is the lead on the project at the client, and basically is looking to bring real-world risk into the way that pension funds set their strategic asset allocation. I had a hand in this one. The government had sponsored an EAST project. EAST is the Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition, and their key thought was risk and opportunity analysis, and it just talks about this, and it then produces this table, which is helping investors to think not about backward-looking risk, which we often do. You all know, of course, there is no risk in the past, it's just outcomes. As a friend of mine taught me many years ago, risk is an ex-ante concept that has an ex-post friend called pain. And then, risk, no, think of volatility, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Sorry, that was probably a tough one for the translators. And a range of things to help us think better about the future. NGFS came alive. This is October last year. They agreed that we needed shorter-term scenarios. 30-year climate scenarios were originally designed for public policy. They're pretty useless for decision-making because if you're on a board, you've probably got a 3 to 5 year horizon. So they said, 3 to 5 years is quite good. And this reflected some work over 2 years ago with 2 colleagues. We set up the Real World Climate Scenarios Initiative, RWCS, because we thought there was a problem. NGFS then published this. The NGFS scenarios do not account for every potential implication of climate change. Dead right. Scenario users should seek to tailor their analyses to suit their needs. Very sensible. And then a whole list of things that probably weren't really addressed in the uncertainty category. So tipping points, physical impacts, societal impacts, migration, compound risks, real life. We're rather proud of this one. This was published the other day. Again, a collaboration between the actuarial profession and the University of Exeter. There's a lot of focus now on tipping points. We can start with the bad ones, the Earth and climate science tipping points. But there's also good tipping points. If people start doing things differently, you can sort of get S-curves in human behavior. So the Climate Scorpion paper recommended firstly a realistic risk assessment, then educate and take action on positive tipping points. Have I increased your agency this afternoon? Discuss. And then develop this idea of planetary solvency. Actuaries, of course, think they know a bit about insurance, and regulating insurance companies gets you to solvency pretty quickly. So let's start talking about planetary solvency. This is some advice we were giving to pension fiduciaries, asset owners, who were sort of slightly bamboozled by their advice. What aspects of the real world has the model omitted? Does the output feel realistic? Go back to that pink slide. Ask a climate scientist. That pink slide, they don't know whether to laugh or cry. And ensure qualitative issues are discussed when you can't just model the risk stuff. Can you ever actually model uncertainty well? Discuss. This is shaking up the world a bit. I've given you two quotes from there. Sustainable finance has two main purposes: providing adequate risk-adjusted returns to investors and directing capital to where the real economy needs it. Now, those of you familiar with modern portfolio theory will know that MPT has no interest in the source of that risk, that volatility. That's a problem. This was taken from a conversation out of the pension fund, which said, you know, government policies on mitigation are pretty weak. Why should we invest in mitigation solutions if governments aren't following it? Maybe we'll head towards adaptation. That's where we're going to make money for our pensioners. And this came from a presentation I gave in Canada a few weeks ago. The pension fund promise can only be delivered if government policy forcefully reduces emissions. Emissions are a government policy thing. So, what might you decide to do differently tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Certainly you have raised some good questions for us. And a mic in the phone, in the floor. No problem, I will take it. Lizeth, Lizeth, ahora va a hacer su presentación. ¿Qué puede decir? ¿Estamos bien? Ya.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos. Muchas gracias a la Superintendencia de Pensiones, a IAOS-BID por la invitación, pues a mis colegas, a Sergio por este panel. El día de hoy pues yo le voy a hablar un poco acerca de la integración de factores ESG específicamente dentro de los fondos de pensiones. Entonces un poco una breve introducción muy rápida acerca de qué es PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment. Es una iniciativa global creada por y para inversionistas en las cuales nosotros trabajamos para ayudarles a entender precisamente cuáles son esas implicaciones de entender los factores ESG dentro de todo su proceso de inversión y cómo pueden proveerles diferentes herramientas acerca de cómo pueden incorporar todos estos factores. Actualmente pues tenemos como partners a las Naciones Unidas, tenemos dentro de nuestra organización más de 5.300 signatarios que manejan cerca de 121 trillones de dólares. Sin embargo, pues es importante hacerles zoom a cómo estamos en Latinoamérica. Actualmente somos 137 signatarios con cerca de 680 $680 billones en activos bajo administración. Si bien es un mercado todavía muy naciente, hemos tenido un importante crecimiento durante los años 2021 y 2022 y nuestros signatarios se encuentran concentrados en 3 mercados principales. El primero de ellos es México, que tenemos 38 signatarios, en donde tenemos 4 de los 10 fondos de pensiones que existen en estos momentos en México. En
Mexico. Then we have Colombia with 35 signatories, and we have 3 out of the 5 pension funds in Colombia. And finally, Chile with 31 signatories and 4 out of the 7 pension funds, Provida, Plan Vital Capital, and Cuprum. Now, to go into details, I'm going to cover what Mike followed, issues related to climate change and why this is relevant for investors, what science says, and why the action of the government is so important to move forward in this agenda. And also, I'm going to share some figures with you in terms of how the investors are responding in Latin America and globally, and what are the next steps that we can take in order to strengthen this ecosystem. So, first of all, what is key, and this is something that we've seen, sometimes fires here in Chile, Colombia, water shortage. So climate change is quite a problem that affects everyone globally, particularly in the case of investors, because it has an impact on the evaluation of their assets, the performance or the yield of the portfolio, and the allocation processes. But it shows opportunities as well as challenges. In terms of the opportunities, of course, this is going to show new investment opportunities. So it's estimated that we need at least $2 trillion by the emerging economies, particularly in the energy sector. It's like 4 or 5 times what they have considered today. Also, we have some risks. For instance, since 2015, this fund has highlighted the lack of adaptation to climate change as one of the main 5 risks that they identify. And as a sectorial sector, we can see that if companies, particularly energy or utilities companies or communication companies, don't make decisions in order to respond to climate issues, most likely they are going to be affected. Now, what about science? So to the right, you can see a graph that shows the temperatures since 1900 until the year 2000, projected until 21. The bars shows the variation in temperature in comparison to pre-industrial areas. And at the bottom, you can see how this is going to affect 3 generations, one born in 2050, one in 1980, and then in the year 2020. In the case of 2020, most of the graphs are in color orange or red. I mean, more than 2 degrees of variance in comparison to what we've seen in pre-industrial eras. So the decisions in terms of, we're going to be facing a warmer world, and that depends on the decisions that we make today. Also, recently, System Change Lab prepared a report that shows what's the status of climate action. So they identify 42 indicators that group all the different energy-related activities, transportation, construction, etc. And only one of them shows to be in compliance, which is the sale of electric cars. All of the other indicators, as you can see, are in yellow or orange. This means that they are moving on the right path, but still they need far more effort to move faster so as to meet the targets. So, for instance, when it comes to power generation, it's been increased by 14% when it comes to wind generation, but we needed to be close to 24. Now, in terms of energy supply with 0 carbon emissions, also it is important to increase the performance of crops in the lands that we have available today, and at the same time we need to reduce emissions. Another indicator, of course, is actually related to that. I mean, it's necessary for crops to increase their performance by 10 times. However, what it's also concerning, and we have 6 indicators in red. The first one is public funding for fossil fuels. There's been an increase in the last 10 years. And there is no evidence about the last ones that I'm going to mention. There's no enough data actually about this, and it's related to the restoration of ecosystems that we've seen globally. On the other hand, the government actions are quite relevant. To the left, we can see the evolution of the different policies or regulations around the world. So we've seen that after 2020 there's been quite a significant increase, particularly in 2021, and we can see the interest of the governments and the policymakers in approaching all of these topics. Particularly in Latin America, we've seen quite significant progress on this. For instance, in Colombia, Chile, and Mexico, there is a regulation about this, or at least the regulation is requiring information about the inclusion of ESG factors as part of their investment processes. However, what's missing, it's also important. For instance, in this graph, we can see the historical emissions and the estimates made in 2020, considering only the policies that we have today. And based on that, we foresee a warming up of approximately 2.7 degrees. Or in the indexes that we have, it's 2.5 degrees. Now, if we establish new commitments, long-term commitments or targets, it would be 2.1 degrees. And if we establish an optimistic scenario where all of these commitments are met, we would have 1.8 degrees higher. So this means that it's really necessary to tackle these issues quite urgently. Now, what are investors doing, or what is necessary for them to do? First, they need to establish within their investment process all of these factors, so meaning that they need to have policies, strategies related to climate change, and not just for them to identify them, but also they need to include them. Number 2, they need to be part in engagement activities. The pension funds play a key role in all of these topics by asking companies where they invest and the investment sectors for this kind of information to move further in the agenda, and also different collaborative activities to help them to be more efficient in this regard. And finally, of course, dissemination. So it is important to reduce the gaps when it comes to reports, for instance, so that we can adopt the recommendations by the TCFD. Now, in the Chilean case, what we've seen, and I'm just going to refer to some specific examples of pension funds here in Chile. The 4 pension funds that are signatories already have as part of their policies issues related to environment engagement. For instance, Provida, it's quite important because they have an internal scoring system that includes ESG and climate change, which is frequently reviewed. Cuprum also assess the climate risks in a comprehensive way, and they also assess the traditional risks. They have several specific committees to assess all these metrics in order to make investment decisions. Now, when it comes to engagement, in the year 2021 and 2022 and also 2023, they ran a pilot program with 15 signatories, Chilean signatories, and they work on engagement issues with different small, medium, and large companies in terms of capitalization, pension funds. So, for instance, Cuprum, Plan Vital, and Provida. But these are important efforts, even though it was a pilot program, but these are important efforts that we are doing here. Now, in terms of dissemination, I would like to highlight the example of Capital. In the year 2022, or for some years now, they've been communicating as part of their investment report about this, and they use metrics related to climate change. So they measure the total carbon emissions and the carbon intensity, the weight carbon intensity, and they also communicate information in terms of the investment approach and how this has increased over time. However, as I mentioned, as Mike mentioned, many signatories have made commitments globally to make progress on this agenda, but the approach between our signatories changes. On the one hand, we have 84% that actually identifies risk and opportunities as part of their investment processes, and close to 30% of the signatories do this in a longer term. So this leads us to 16%, which is actually not identifying any risks and opportunities related to the weather, to the climate. And this percentage is even higher, particularly in emerging markets such as the Latin American markets, and this case is close to 25%. On the other hand, it's very important, because of transparency issues, to disseminate information, particularly using the recommendation of TCFD. Of course, we need to improve, because close to 69% doesn't communicate information related to TCFD. Close to 30% do it, and approximately 25% do it in each of the categories when it comes to governance strategies, risks, or recommendations. Now, if you analyze whether one of the recommendations uses actually some scenarios to test or assess the resilience of their portfolio or their investment strategies within the different climate scenarios, only 39% actually does it. And there is a positive correlation between the size of the fund or the size of the investors and how they use these practices. So smaller investors can do it. So as you can see on the slide, almost 81% of the first bar don't do it. Now, what are the next steps, or what do we need to do? In general terms, number one, it's to create the right environment. Number two, to foster investment opportunities. And number three, to expedite the inclusion of ESG factors and the active exercise of all of everyone. So as I mentioned earlier, we've seen important progress in the region when it comes to preparing strategies locally, when it comes to classification, and in terms of dissemination requirements related to pension funds, and also in general about the companies. But still, it's very important to continue to foster this agenda and actually to implement it. Number two, although the government, it's very important, plays an important role to establish a focus in terms of public policies and also to provide us with the right incentives, it's also very important to the collaboration between the different entities. Multilateral banks, institutional investors, companies, stock exchange, with the purpose of improving the equity market. And the other one of the main issues that we've identified is that of data. Although it's a global problem, it's more serious in the emerging markets, where we don't really have a good quality or availability of data about the companies where investors invest. Therefore, it's necessary to start working on that. On the other hand, the pension funds have some restrictions in terms of liquidity and risks that restrict their investment. So it's necessary to have a pool of projects that can guide them or give them the opportunity to access to sustainable investment opportunities aligned with their objectives. And we need to see how we can align all of these incentives. And finally, we need to focus on how we can help to accelerate the inclusion of ESG factors and active exercise. The first one is strengthening and the investment practices. You know, how we can strengthen policies and the strategies. So it's not just identification, but we should move towards implementation. Number two, it's key to foster opportunities for international and national investors to interact interact and find engagement activities in a collaborative way, so as to learn and to reduce costs, create efficiencies, and improve these practices. And number 3 is to maintain alliances, to continue to provide permanent technical support when it comes to responsible investment. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have the floor. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I have several challenges. The first one is to fight the nap time. Manchester City is playing Real Madrid, and the third challenge is that I speak way too fast. I don't have a very good Spanish. I will try to speak slowly so that you can follow me. I want to thank the organizers. The bank has a series of sectors or areas. We have a number of areas. I belong to the labor market and social security department that has I coordinate the issues of pensions in the region with 3 major focuses with coverage, sustainability, and equity. But there are 3 key topics that are extremely interesting for us: gender equality, digital transformation, and institutional arrangement. But the climate change, it's a topic that is also part of the concerns for IADB. So in that context, last year we started working on a document about the introduction of sustainability criteria in terms of pension fund investments. We worked with lots of people, but mainly this was a study that was led by Fernando Lopez, who's here present with us. And one way or another, that gathers many of the topics, and it's a document that we are going to publish soon. Why we covered certain approaches. We checked several academic articles about profitability, but there are 2 topics on which I'm going to focus. First one is how are pension funds addressing the ESG criteria, and also what is the vision or the perception of the beneficiaries regarding the introduction of ESG criteria. It is a report that is intended to identify alternatives for introducing ESG criteria in managing pension funds, that basically, due to the size of pension funds in the economy on the long-term horizon, there are risks associated to the profitability impact and the externalities that these investments may create. So let's get started then. We know that responsible investment principles, PRI, are a benchmark in terms of sustainable investments globally, and a minimum standard for the integration of ESG factors in the investment decisions. PRI has more than 4,000 signatories, more than 60 countries, assets for about $120 billion, and that is the minimum standard for the introduction of ESG factors. But what is the interest that exists in the case of the introduction of ESG factors into pension fund management? This is the European asset allocation by Mercer ranks how the different pension funds are integrating ESG risks in their investment decisions. And we can see that although there is enormous variety among the different countries, on average, 76% of the funds that were asked include ESG, and 24% don't include it, and it's a significant variability between in Belgium, Spain on the top, and Portugal and Sweden at the bottom. So the second question is, what is driving? What is the main driver for pension funds to introduce ESG criteria? Close to 70% say that it's because of regulatory reasons. Due to regulatory reasons, they're including that, and 40% say that it's due to the financial materialization of the risks, and 35% do it because of reputational risks. And these data are very interesting. I'm going to compare this to the regional data to see how these topics change. How do they integrate ESG factors among plans? Close to 90% do a follow-up of the investment administrator. 83% they check it through making the right selection, 79% through reporting, and 64% focus on the investment strategy and strategic asset allocation. And by organizing, and this the idea is to organize what are the three factors are the most relevant or more important. One is the highest importance and three is the lowest importance, and here you can see environmental matters are the ones having a larger score, followed by social factors, and finally by governance factors. These data are exactly the opposite compared to a survey that I'm going to show later on in the region. Since there's an increasing introduction of environmental criteria in investment decisions, the question is, what is the relevance for the pensions sector to introduce the ESG criteria? And we identified four main lines. The first one, everything having to do with long-term financial performance and fiduciary responsibility. Of course, many of the pension funds believe that companies with very sound ESG practices are more likely to achieve sustainable financial performances. This is due to the fact that those companies have a lower probability of facing reputational risks or regulatory fines or legal disputes that may affect one way or another the financial performance of the companies. The second topic is the regulatory aspects that I will discuss later on, that there's a regulatory drive towards ESG with authorities that are issuing regulations and legislation that foster the adoption of sustainable practices and to also be transparent in the way they manage their affairs. The third reason is through pressure coming from stakeholders. Pension funds are becoming more and more responsible to their governments, beneficiaries, and public at large because of the social and environmental impact of their investments. So investing on ESG for pension funds, it's evidence that they are actually acting on the best interest of their stakeholders. And the other driver are moral and ethics considerations, that some pension funds are investing on ESG because they believe it's the right thing to do from the ethical point of view, and they'd like to support companies that are adopting measures to implement or address social and environmental issues. So these are the main drivers of why pension funds are investing on ESG factors. But there's something key here, which is one of the main challenges. One of the one of the main challenges to implement investments are related to information availability, because information is what allows investors to assess risks and investment decisions. The thing is that the main sources of information, which are ranking agencies to assess ESG factors in these companies, have certain rankings that are issued by these rating agencies. In order to build those rankings, they have three categories. They have attributes, they have indicators that quantify those attributes, and they have weightings that are used for each one of those indicators. For each one of these elements, there are differences in terms of the different rating agencies and different studies showing that there are significant differences in terms of sustainability. And here we're going to give you an example. A study developed by Berg, Köbel, and Rigobon, they say that rating agencies use a very broad range of, for example, in companies from 1,600 to 9,000, and indicators from 38 to close to 300 indicators. And in terms of categories, it ranges from 27 to 56. So, given these differences, the authors found that there may be there are significant differences, and this information is received by decision makers, and it can be relatively noisy, if you wish, when making investments regarding ESG. There are differences in the standards, differences in the measurement, and also the weighting factors that may impact the information that is provided. And one of the big topics included in the document, it goes over how regulatory matters have changed in different countries. I will not dwell on details here, but you can see, unfortunately, the speaker is speaking every time more away from the microphone. It is very difficult to hear. In the last few years, there's been an exponential. Apologies to the translators. There's no time enough. There have been significant changes in the US and Asia, and recently in Latin America. In the last few years, there's been significant progress. And in this slide, we can see now how 5 countries in the region that have been the leading countries in introducing sustainability criteria, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, have made significant strides in different topics related to the introduction of ESG standards in their investment schemes. But something quite relevant is that a survey was run. We wanted to do a survey about how the biggest pension funds were introducing ESG factors. And in order to do that, we identified the 100 largest pension funds with the largest amounts of assets, and we identified the 35 that were signatories of the principles, followed Europe, followed by the US, and then Asia, that actually were managing $7 trillion. Here you can see the pension funds. And what did we find? What we found is that 100% of these pension funds had a policy that described sustainable investment in general, 100% of them. But by classifying those, 80% of them had very explicit guidelines in terms of governance, 74% had guidelines regarding environmental matters, and less than 70% had guidelines related to social matters. 86% had policies on exclusion, 83% had dialogue policies, and 63% had specific guidelines by asset classes. Close to 100% had a definition of the way in which ESG criteria are to be understood, and 94% addressed the issue related to the active exercise of property, understood as the use of the rights in order to influence the behavior of companies in which they invest. Regarding these topics, close to 90% introduces reporting aspects regarding sustainable investment. 77% consider specifically climate change matters. And this is key. Close to 30% introduce among their policies understanding the preferences for sustainability that customers and beneficiaries express. And this is very much in line with data that I'm going to show later. Who is in charge of the implementation? In 97% of the cases, the role of supervision is in the hands of top management, and 94% on the board of directors. And in terms of implementation, 86% is in the hands of personnel that is devoted to sustainable investment practices, and 80% also use external administrators. Now, as to the introduction of the criteria by type of asset, most of the funds introduce ESG aspects in their investment processes, especially in the case of stock or equity. Now, in Brazil, I want to compare this with Brazil data. The Pension Superintendency in Brazil, Brevic, run a survey among their pension funds. And there are four important findings. The first one is that the majority are using ESG criteria by using investment risk criteria, but the way in which they introduce them is only occasionally and not on an ongoing basis or systemically. Unlike what we showed in the previous data, the main one is the topics related to governance, and environmental topics are in the third category, in the third place. And the main reasons to consider these criteria, the first one is because they help manage investment risk. The second is because they are an indication of the management quality, and 40% say that is because of regulatory requirements. If you remember, that was the first topic when we talked about pension funds. Now we saw what were the reasons why they were using them. Now the reasons why they are not using them. And if you see, the three first reasons are connected with information topics. The first one is difficulty to compare information provided by companies, insufficient qualitative information, and low quality of the information. So the top three reasons for not introducing ESG criteria are associated to information quality issues. And if you see here, in the end, low publishing frequency, and there's one also associated to costs. And now, the question to pension funds, there are different questions to see whether they're in agreement or not. The first question, the ESG criteria used, does it improve investment performance? 80% of the funds say yes, that they agree with the fact that the use of ESG criteria do improve investment performance. Should regulation demand the use of ESG criteria in investment risk analysis? 72% they say they are partially in disagreement. Beneficiaries, this is something that is in red as well. Beneficiaries of my pension fund consider the use of ESG criteria as irrelevant to the analysis of investment risks. Beneficiaries, only 50% say that they are neutral or indifferent, and 34% say they agree. So the point of view of beneficiaries or members is not necessarily considered in these topics. So we have seen, let me summarize. We started seeing how large pension funds introduce ESG criteria. Then we looked at what the experience was in Brazil. But now, from the point of view of the beneficiary, we ran a survey back in 1992 to 2,000 people to see 2022, and what is the perception of beneficiaries in terms of how ESG criteria are introduced. The first conclusion, low level of knowledge about sustainable investment. 60% haven't heard about sustainable investments. 63% do not know whether they are more or less profitable compared to traditional investment. 60% do not know whether they are more or less expensive, and also 60% do not know whether sustainable investment are more or less risky. So the first conclusion is that the beneficiaries don't know about this. Second conclusion, most of the sample know about climate change and they believe that this could negatively affect the profitability of pension funds. Majority of people believe that climate change is happening currently, that there's something happening and it's not a joke. 76% believe that climate change may worsen the well-being of the country, and 51% believe that it may reduce profitability, and only 4% believe that it could increase it. The majority believe that the state, companies and markets are insufficient to address climate change challenges, and the majority also believe that members and pension funds may have an impact on the decisions that companies make in their investments. So this is a myriad of information, where are they investing and how regulatory aspects have grown and the point of view of the members, and maybe some recommendations that I believe have been discussed already in the previous presentation. Of course, information is key. We saw that in Brazil, the 3 reasons in order not to use ESG criteria are related to information topics. The second one, education matters. The third one, by trying to characterize preferences in some of the questions, if they should create a specific type of fund to better characterize the preferences of the members. And the last one, the objectives of the investments must continue to be focused on achieving adequate profitability. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, now we are going to have the presentation by the last panel member, Carola. I'd like to greet the superintendent and thank you for the invitation, and AIOS and the organization of this event. They made sure everything went well. Okay, so I just want to show you how the Ministry of Finance is playing a role to align the financial flows towards sustainable development. So they said it was very important for us to play a role, and that was also very important to create certain certainties and predictable regulation environment, and to have a private and public cooperation. Now, why do the Ministries of Finance play a role? of course, along with the Ministry of Energy or Environment, and basically because the Ministry of Finance determines the public spending and everything related to face climate change. And to set the example when it comes to investment and spending in relation to the climate. They also deal with public hiring, management. I'm not going to read everything that I have in the slide, but taxes, subsidies, taxing incentives, debt management also, which is one of the topics I'm going to focus on in the presentation. And in general, we need to create an environment to move, to foster the investment of the private sector. International forums say, in general, that the role of the public sector is key, and it's actually this one. I mean, without moving resources from the private sector and also, of course, from the public sector, it's impossible to close the gaps to get to the targets. Now, what's also important is that the Ministry of Finance plays a role of coordination within the government and also when it comes to international cooperation. And there is also a direct relationship with multilateral cooperation. So we guide the support when it comes to funding, but also technical support. In Chile, we have a preliminary NDC from 2015, then it was authorized 2021. We have a framework law. We are a few of the countries in the world that have certain targets, the governization targets in 2025 climate strategy in the long term, and this act that leads to certain actions through this long-term climate strategy mandates the Ministry of Funding to create a financial strategy which sets the basis and the guidelines to move public and private funds. Now, the current financial strategy has 3 pillars that have been summarized in Make Finance Green, which means to create information to fund the green projects, to mobilize resources towards sustainable activities, and also to capture opportunity, which is to increase competitiveness, to consolidate leadership, the regional leadership of Chile in sustainable finance, but also to learn from the best practices, to take the opportunity of us being part of a community to face a global issue. So I'm going to share some examples about the first 2 pillars, to fund the green. Chile leads the market of thematic bonds. Currently, the stock gets to 36 or 38% of the total stock of public spending in social bonds, green, sustainable, and some others related to sustainability. Now, in terms of registered bonds, we are a country with the highest volume of issuance of thematic bonds. So we are saying that in absolute terms, we have the highest level of issuance, but relatively speaking, in terms of the breakout of the public spending, we are also those who have the highest portion. So we've been innovating. Well, Joaquin mentioned this. So since 2019, we had the first issuance of green bonds in the region. We were number 2 in social bonds. And here we have the distribution that I mentioned earlier. 2021. Because of the pandemic, of course, we have here the bonds that had an underlying aspect of social projects were triggered. And then we see that we have sustainable bonds. Green, social, sustainable are bonds that are called resource-related bonds, and there is an underlying activity to be funded by the public spending in comparison to the sustainability bond that it's related to sustainability, but there is no underlying project, but there are targets for the future. And the issuer makes a commitment makes a commitment to meet that target, and the investor follows that, and if they don't comply with that, there is a punishment on that deadline. I don't want to go into the details about this, but if you have any questions, well, I would like to say that most of the success of our strategy as a country, it's been to have frameworks that clearly define the how we're going to make the transactions, how we're going to be using the resources, what are going to be the categories, and how we have to verify that this happens, of course with the opinion of other parties. So all of this gives a foundation that it's very transparent, and it's very attractive also for investors. Now, in terms of the bonds related to sustainability, as I was saying, you issue a bond, and at the time of the issuance or signing the contract, there is a 10 or 20-year term commitment, for instance, related to, I don't know, the NDC or the decarbonization goals. So that it's verified by 2040, and if there is no compliance, the coupon rate increases. It's a step up. Now, I would like to mention that this was, in 2022, early in 2022, we issued the first SBT bond, and it was issued by Chile, so congratulations to the team. And we consider this as a strategy, as a funding strategy, and as a public or a state strategy, because these are long-term funding, and the good thing is that you can rely on these frameworks because it's permanent, so it allows investors to have certainty in terms of the behavior of the sovereignty bond. So we were leading this, and mid next year we started working on an indicator focused on gender. So this would be the only bond related to sustainability with a social target. So we sold it 10 or 12 times more than one we expected. And I would like to refer to the benefits of this type of bonds, at least the benefits that we've seen from the Ministry of Finance and as a country. By innovating on this, but also assuming the responsibility of creating these frameworks that can be verifiable, allow us to have a Chilean instrument very attractive, because it's an emerging market, but it's an emerging market with an investment rate. And on top of that, we are issuing an instrument that has growing demand in the world. So we are, like, I don't know, particular, let's say, or special. So this has created quite a significant demand, so it allows us to diversify the investors. So we've managed to set good conditions. We've been able to have benchmarks, to create benchmarking, and also there is something additional that hasn't been mentioned, and this has allowed us to improve the coordination of the different sectors between the different ministries, and I'm referring to the fact that we need to verify how projects progress. So, for instance, electromobility projects. So that means that we have constant verification on the progress of these projects and others. Now, as for risks, the most important one, which is the greenwashing, and Chile is very attractive because this is almost a risk that is zero here, but this doesn't mean that it won't happen to us because of poor behavior from other similar instruments. Now I would like to move to the other pillar, because I would like to focus on two. And what means to be green and what's not being green. And this is from a presentation that I saw a few days ago, by the way. And I thought this was very interesting, to see what's happening with the ESG assets and what the funds are doing. And this has been growing quite significantly. And what we see here is that, even Waldo mentioned this, but those who want to become ESG or want to be called ESG, they have better returns. I mean, the ESG assets are more attractive. However, greenwashing is also a reality. So then the exercise that I saw is that, having the funds having a label, or maybe the fact that they change names, leads to a positive flow to those who had names that seem more green, so to speak. So we've also seen a lot of problems in terms of dressing green, even if you're not really green. So we are really interested in seeing what it's actually green. And we need to know, everyone wants to know this, because it improves reputation, the engagement with the stakeholders, it increases the funding alternatives. Also, it's also interesting for the investors, so it improves the identification when it comes to risk and the way in which you compare assets. And if of interest, of general interest, of course, because people want to know what they are buying, what they are investing on. Of course, the government has interest on this because they guide the investments, and it's of interest for the NGOs. So what we need here are more transparent markets with better information. We need to get rid of fractions in order to make the market more efficient in terms of resource allocation when it comes to sustainable activities. And of course, it increased the interest to participate in these activities. So we are working on a project for a while now, which was created as a need from the financial sector as part of this public and private alliance. And we saw the need to be able to classify what's green and what's not. And I'm trying to be very simple in the way I express myself in this way, but we really need to have a classification system, which is what's called a taxonomy of different economic activities. I mean, I'm not talking about companies or projects, but activities which are environmentally sustainable. And I'm saying this because we are working on a classification with environmental objectives only in the Ministry of Finance. For instance, I think that the Mexican classification also have gender-related targets. In our case, it's just environment. And this is a classification system. It is just set clear criteria, and it's based on science. So we need to have objective, reliable, and verifiable criteria. Otherwise, we are not going to meet any of the purposes that we have, which is to separate green from what's not green. Now, this is not a mandatory list of activities. That's not the purpose, and it's not what this classification wants to be. It doesn't intend to establish mandatory requirements. And a question that we get, which is also very important to mention, is whether it strengthens the efforts for permitting. I mean, it's good because we are standardizing concepts. Sometimes you tend to think that standardization, in terms of what you need now, it's enough. But we've noticed that there is no standardization, and we can see this internationally. We've seen that there are 600 classifications or indicators, more than 4,500 indicators. Actually, this was mentioned in a previous presentation. So the idea is to be able to standardize all the standards, the sectorial standards. Now, of course, we are going to add some criterion to see whether the activities contribute or not to environmental objectives. And on top of that, a local classification system would allow us to be able to recognize the characteristics of our own economy, to embrace that. So, for instance, we use the European classification, but In terms of the structure of a classification, I mean, what are the objectives and the characteristics? We want them to use the same language. Now, in terms of how we define our economy, whether an activity contributes more or less towards a certain target, those threshold or criteria need to be defined based on the operation of our own economy. So we need to acknowledge the local economy, but also we need interoperability. So it's quite a large effort. So we've defined goals, economic sectors, we've determined the economic activities within certain sectors and some minimum rules to see for instance, the level of contribution of an economic activity to the mitigation of climate change, for instance. So that would be one of the goals we could test on. Now, in order to develop this classification, and in relation to the need to work together, so once we define the classification structure, then the core of those or the classification criteria, what's going to allow us to make the classification, they need to be defined by the private sector. We need to work with experts and they need to know the sectors in detail. It needs to go to a reviewers group that need to share their opinion openly. They just need to register in the website of the Ministry of Finance. I mean, this needs to be an open process and actually in progress. So the idea is that by the end of the year, we should have the first system of classification to start implementing the system next year. So this tool or this classification system is seen as a tool that is going to be available, and we're going to continue to work with the technical experts this year. We want to have a first version, and also we need to understand that this is a live tool. I mean, technologies change, right? So the way in which we define this contribution is also going to change over time. It cannot be It can't be an immediate change. It needs to be well planned, thinking in the medium term, so that investment decisions can also focus on the long term without being interrupted. Now, along with this innovation, what we have, you know that I mentioned these three pillars, and of course, since economies evolve, we need to update that strategy. So, what we are doing today, the first one was based only on the NDC objective, so the current one responds to the update of the NDC, so that we need to have a long-term climate strategy. And now that we have passed the environmental law, there is several climate tools, and this is sort of like a battery of tools that will help you to move towards concrete actions. And these concrete actions need to be feasible to be implemented, because if there are no funds to implement certain actions, then the compliance with our goals is going to be delayed. So a new strategy needs to understand where the gaps are in order to fund those actions. And this is what we are doing now through a study that is going to be done by Dicta Green Lab. And this study allows us to identify certain actions, most of them with investment components, to cover those actions, to disaggregate them regionally, because it's also important to see where the gaps are and to set priorities. So you always need to prioritize, right? So you cannot just fund everything at once. You need to see what are the sectors that need it the most or the ones that make a higher contribution. So this is why the study proposes a matrix for prioritization. This is very interesting because it's based on technical criteria, but also has an expert criteria to determine whether an activity is better prepared than another, or that has more certainty about the effectiveness and the cost of that measure, or whether it may be more attractive because there is higher contribution into mitigation or adaptation, for instance. So in summary, this is what we've been working on. And of course, we can no longer dissociate facing climate change or the impact of climate change and the loss of biodiversity and contamination. So normally we talk about a triple crisis, and now so there is consensus internationally that we need to tackle all of this together, and therefore the next strategy, hopefully by 2025, should include financial alignment towards biodiversity and a fair socio-ecological transition also. And of course, this considers biodiversity. I mean, a collective effort by all the different ministries, along, of course, with the Ministry of Environment. So this is what we've been working on. Thank you.